The crowd gathered in the dry wind between the chapel and the stockade, where peace was always spoken of in louder tones than it was lived, and Corinne stood in the center with her hands folded like she was praying. But she wasn't. She was waiting. Her husband had died 3 weeks earlier, run through in a drunken trade gone wrong with the Blackfeet, and though no one said it out loud, the town had decided the fault lay with her. Too proud, too silent, too cursed. So when the council struck a treaty with the Blackfeet to settle tensions and honor peace, they offered livestock, flour, and last her, a widow with no land, no kin, and no child. A gesture, they called it, a kindness. The warrior who accepted her stood silent and still, face painted in dark lines that caught the sun like truth. He didn't look at her like the others had, like she was a sack of flour or something to be pitied. He didn't look at her at all. Not until the mayor stepped back and muttered, "She's yours now." The moment cracked like a bone in the wind. Corinne lowered her eyes, numb, veil blowing soft around her face. She hadn't spoken since they'd led her from the church cellar. She hadn't cried. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. But she walked forward, each step heavier than the last, until she stood before the warrior with nothing but her silence, and the bitter scrape of her wedding band still clinging to her finger. The crowd murmured, waiting for him to take her by the wrist, to pull her toward whatever camp or cart waited beyond the hill. But he didn't move. He reached into a pouch at his side, pulled out a folded scrap of hide, and placed it in the mayor's hands. Payment. Then he turned to Corinne, and with a voice so calm it made the breeze hush, said, "I bought a life, not a servant." The words hit her harder than any hand could have. She blinked, looked up. He met her gaze, not with claim, but with invitation. "You walk when you're ready," he said. Then he turned and began walking away. No tug, no demand, just distance widening between her and the men who'd traded her like grain. Corinne didn't move at first. Couldn't. But something inside her cracked, not from pain, but from recognition. She took a step, then another, and then, still in the dress they'd buried her in, she followed. The townspeople said nothing. They'd never seen a woman walk that slow and still look free. The warrior didn't glance back. He didn't need to. He knew she would come. And Corinne, for the first time in weeks, felt her lungs fill with something that might one day become breath again. The walk to his dwelling took most of the afternoon, not because it was far, but because Corinne's legs moved like they were remembering what freedom felt like with every step. And Makoye, the Blackfeet warrior who'd spoken that line no one had dared speak in town, never once rushed her. He kept just ahead, guiding with silence, never looking back, as if trust were a trail she had to walk without being pulled. When they reached the rise where the trees thinned and the mountain wind carried pine and smoke in equal measure, she saw it. A single lodge, circular, built from hide and timber with soft firs stretched at the entrance, and a fire already smoking through the hole at the top. There were no fences, no dogs, no chains, just space. Makoye held the flap open, but said nothing. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The air was warm, clean. A basin of water rested near the fire, and blankets carefully folded lined the sides. Corinne expected commands, a gesture, a pointing finger. But he simply walked to the fire, sat down cross-legged, and poured water from a pot into 2 bowls. One he set in front of her. The other he drank without comment. She stood still, arms clenched at her sides, unsure whether to thank him or flinch. "You're safe here," he said at last. "I will not ask anything you do not give." Her eyes narrowed. "Then why take me?" He didn't flinch at the sharpness in her voice. "Because if I had not, they would have given you to a worse man, or to no man, and you deserve not to be discarded like bone." She didn't sit, didn't eat. "You don't know what I deserve." "I know what no one deserves," he said, "to be traded without voice." That made her stop. She lowered herself slowly to the fur-lined floor, her knees folding under a body still shaking from humiliation. "What now?" she asked. Makoye shrugged. "You sleep. You heal. You remember how to speak on your own terms." His words weren't wrapped in gentleness, but in steadiness, like stone that wouldn't break if leaned on. Corinne looked around the lodge, noticing for the first time the absence of everything she feared. No ropes, no cuffs, no weapons pointed at her, and, perhaps strangest of all, no door that locked from the outside. Just an open flap and a fire that crackled with no secrets. She pulled the bowl toward her and took a sip, her hands barely steady. The broth was simple, root and fat, but it tasted like permission. Later that night, when Makoye had retreated outside and she lay wrapped in a fur she'd chosen herself, Corinne reached for her wedding ring, slipped it from her finger, and placed it quietly under the edge of the blanket. It no longer marked love or loyalty, only ownership. She didn't cry, but she didn't sleep either. And as she stared into the dark curve of the lodge ceiling, she wondered what kind of man made space for a woman without asking to fill it. Morning came not with noise, but with light, soft gold slipping between the flaps of the lodge, warming Corinne's cheek before she opened her eyes. For a moment, she forgot where she was. There were no slamming doors, no muttered curses from a husband who hated how quiet she'd become. No town bells marking the hour she'd failed to kneel at the chapel. Just warmth, fur beneath her, and the low crackle of fire. She sat up slowly, hair tangled from sleep, and her hand instinctively reached to the back of her head. Her braid, tight, unbroken, still held with the same black ribbon she'd worn the day they gave her away. It had been tied by the pastor's wife, hands pinching and rushed, saying, "If you're to be given, at least look neat." Corinne's fingers hovered over it now. Then, slowly, she tugged the ribbon free. One pull, then another. The braid loosened, unraveled, fell apart like it had been waiting. Her hair spilled over her shoulders, wild, uneven from neglect. But it felt like hers again. She didn't bind it back, just let it hang. When she stepped outside, Makoye was crouched by the creek, hands stained with ochre as he painted a new bow. He looked up when she approached, nodded once, then returned to his work. She stood there, arms crossed against the cold, watching. "You knew I'd come out," she said. "No," he replied, "but I left food in case you did." She glanced at the bundle on the stone. Flatbread, a bit of dried meat, an apple. Clean. Enough. "I undid the braid," she said suddenly, unsure why she wanted him to know. He didn't turn. "Good. That was never mine to keep." His words surprised her, not because of their meaning, but because of the way he said them. Not as praise, not as dismissal, just truth. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted. "They gave me to you like I was done. Finished, like a problem paid off." Makoye placed the bow aside and washed his hands in the stream. "Then they are blind. You are not finished." Corinne sat on a log nearby, the morning air slipping into her sleeves. "You could have taken me," she said. "They expected you to. So did I." Makoye met her eyes. "Then they taught you wrong." Silence stretched between them, but not unkindly. "Why do you live alone?" she asked. "No tribe, no woman, no—" "My brother was killed by settlers trying to steal a horse," he said simply. "After that, I could not look at the village fires without seeing what we burned to make peace." She didn't ask more, and he didn't offer. But something passed between them then. Not sympathy, but recognition. The kind of grief that doesn't need to be explained. "What now?" she asked again. "You braid your own hair, you eat, you walk as far as you wish. And if you stay—" He looked at her now, eyes steady. "You are not servant, you are woman. You choose what happens next." Corinne didn't answer, not right away. But she reached for the apple, bit into it, and let the juice run down her chin. Sweet, unexpected, alive. And for the first time since the day they led her into the trade yard like a goat, she didn't feel like someone's burden. She felt like someone who could begin again. She found it tucked inside the satchel they'd shoved at her when they handed her off. The white veil, creased and yellowed at the edges, still smelling faintly of candle smoke and rose water. It had been her husband's mother's, passed down like silver or livestock, and Corinne hadn't dared throw it away before, not even after the bruises, not even after the grave. But now, in the clearing beside Makoyi's creek, she held it up in both hands and watched how the light caught the stitching. Lace that had once meant purity and now felt like a shroud. Makoyi sat nearby, carving arrowheads in the sun, saying nothing, but aware. He always was. Corinne walked to the water's edge, kneeled in the damp grass, and began to dig with her fingers. The soil was soft from snowmelt, dark and clean. She didn't make a speech, didn't weep. Just folded the veil once, then again, and laid it into the earth like a body she no longer mourned. When she covered it, she pressed the soil flat with both palms, feeling the chill seep into her skin like finality. "That belonged to your husband?" Makoyi asked gently when she returned to the fire. "No," she said. "It belonged to the woman they wanted me to be." He nodded once. "Then it is right to bury her." That night she helped with the stew, only barely, but enough to touch something that fed them both. They ate by the fire, her braid loose, her hands scraped from digging, and when she looked across at him, she no longer saw a warrior she'd been given to. She saw the only man who hadn't tried to fix her, claim her, or offer a future as payment for her past. "Do the others know you took me?" she asked suddenly. "Your people?" Makoyi stirred the pot once more. "I sent word. Told them I traded for peace, not property." "And they believed you?" "They believed I would not lie." Corinne stared into the flames. "The people who gave me away. They lied with every word they used to bless me." Makoyi looked up, eyes reflecting the fire. "Then stop speaking their language in your heart." The words lodged in her ribs, not because they hurt, but because they made space. She stood and walked to her bedroll without another word. But as she lay down, the wind rustling the lodge walls like slow breath, she found her fingers tracing the spot on her scalp where the veil used to press. It was gone now, buried, not burned, not torn. Buried, like something that once lived but didn't deserve to be carried further. And outside, she could hear Makoyi murmuring softly in his tongue. Not to her, not to the spirits, but to the night itself, like a man who didn't need to be answered to feel understood. The storm rolled in hard and fast, not from the sky, but from the ground, wind rising like breath from the canyons, dragging dirt and sleet in horizontal sheets across the ridgeline, as Makoyi and Corinne returned from gathering wild onions at the tree line. She wasn't used to these storms, the way they swept in without thunder, but with fury, sudden and sharp. By the time they reached the lodge, her skirt was soaked, her fingers numb, and her hair, loosed from its knot, whipped like a banner behind her. Inside, Makoyi lit the fire with practiced hands, stacking dry cedar and coaxing flame with the breath of someone who'd always known what cold could take. Corinne stripped off her shawl and boots but said nothing, teeth clacking as she wrapped herself in one of the furs and crouched near the flames. She was shaking, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the memory of another storm. The night her husband locked her out on the porch because she'd forgotten to salt the stew. She hadn't remembered it in weeks, but now it returned with a force that choked her breath. Makoye must have sensed it. He passed her a steaming bowl without a word and sat down a few feet away, not touching her, not crowding, just there. The wind battered the hide walls, but the lodge held. "You've seen worse," he said quietly, eyes on the fire. "Yes," she replied, voice cracking, "but not with someone waiting inside." The words escaped before she could hold them, and she felt her throat tighten with shame. Not because she'd spoken truth, but because of how small it sounded. Makoye only nodded. "Many storms are survived outside, but they do not leave you whole." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw the scar across his temple, a healed line that had not been there when she first arrived. "That from battle?" she asked. "Number from falling," he said. "When I was young, I thought standing alone made me stronger. I climbed too high. The mountain disagreed." Corinne huffed a soft breath that might have been laughter. "The people I come from, they don't fall. They just push others off." Makoye's gaze didn't waver. "They pushed you, and still you're here." A long silence passed before she said, "I want to stay." He didn't smile. He didn't rush to respond. He simply said, "Then stay." And somehow, that was enough. The wind shrieked once, then softened, like even the storm was listening. Corinne reached for the pot of water beside the fire and dipped her hands into the warmth. Her fingers, red and raw, flexed slowly, as if remembering they were hers. She looked up. "Do you always wait out storms this way?" "There's no other way," he replied. "Except through." She leaned back against the wall, braid damp across her collarbone, and watched the fire curl around the wood. Outside, the wind howled. But inside the lodge, she didn't feel trapped. She felt sheltered. And as the flames danced higher, Makoye rose, took his blanket, and moved to the far corner, giving her space, offering peace. And in the hush between gusts, she whispered to the fire, more to herself than to him, "Next time, I want to wait with you." The next morning brought silence so thick, it seemed even the birds had paused to listen. Snow dusted the grass outside, fine as ash, and Corinne woke wrapped in a stillness that didn't scare her. Makoye was already outside, chopping firewood with rhythmic precision, his bare arms flexing with each strike, breath misting with effort. She watched from the lodge flap, arms crossed, unsure why the sight of him working alone stirred something both warm and sad inside her. He hadn't touched her, hadn't asked her to tend the fire, or clean, or even cook unless she offered. It was unsettling in its own way, how nothing was expected. After years of measuring her worth by how quickly she served, the quiet stretched too long, too loose. So she stepped outside and took up the small hatchet leaning against the log pile. "Show me how," she said. He paused, sweat along his brow, and looked at her, not with surprise but with consideration. Then he nodded. "Hold it like this." His hands guided hers, slow, firm, and then stepped back. She struck the log. Missed. Tried again. The wood split with a satisfying crack. "You learn fast," he said. "I had to," she muttered. "Back home, mistakes got you locked out for a night." Makoye's face didn't soften, but something in his eyes darkened, like anger held respectfully. "No one locks doors here, not even the wind." They chopped in rhythm after that, sweat steaming off their backs. When the pile was done, Corinne's arms trembled with exhaustion, but a smile tugged at her mouth. She hadn't worked for anyone's praise. She'd worked for the warmth that now waited in stacked logs. Over the fire, she made bread, flat and burnt at the edges, but McCoy ate it without flinching. "You should have left me there," she said finally. "It wasn't your fight." "It was my fire they tried to douse," he replied, "and I will not trade peace for silence." She studied him. "Do I owe you for that?" McCoy met her gaze. "You are not in my debt." Corinne flinched at how easily he said it, like it wasn't even a question. "Everyone I've ever known kept a ledger. Even kindness had a price." Then they never knew kindness. The air between them shifted. She didn't reach for his hand. He didn't move closer. But something passed between their eyes, like two souls nodding in recognition. That night, when she lay down, she whispered into the fur-lined darkness, "I want to give something back." She didn't know what yet. Not her body, not a vow, but something real, something hers. And as she drifted to sleep, she felt a strange lightness in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the ground being cleared for something to grow. Outside, McCoy stirred the fire one last time and whispered into the coals, "She is not mine, but she is not broken." And the wind, soft now, didn't answer. But it didn't disagree. She hadn't meant for him to see it. The scar was old, too old to bleed, but never old enough to forget. It lived high on her left shoulder, just beneath the collarbone, where her first husband had once pressed a hot iron poker after she'd said the wrong thing in front of his brother. A curling shape, ugly and raised, like a brand. She kept it hidden, always had, but that morning as she fetched water from the stream, her shawl slipped and she didn't catch it in time. McCoy had followed behind, carrying the second pail, and his gaze caught on the mark before she could tug the fabric back. He didn't ask, didn't speak, just waited until they reached the lodge, where she slammed the pot down harder than necessary. "It's not what you think," she said before he could open his mouth. "It wasn't punishment. It was proof." McCoy sat by the fire, hands resting on his knees. "Proof of what?" She didn't look at him. "That I belonged to someone. That I couldn't run. It made sure everyone else knew, too." The silence grew tight, but not cruel. She kept her back to him, her voice a dull blade. "He used to say I needed it, that otherwise I'd forget who I was." A pause. Then his voice, low and certain. "He lied." She turned slowly, braid over her shoulder, jaw clenched. "I know that now, but knowing doesn't remove it." McCoy reached for a coal-blackened bowl and crushed a sprig of mountain sage inside. "In my people's way," he said, "when something leaves a mark, we honor the body that survived it, not hide it, not erase it, but remind it, you are more than what was done to you." Corinne laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You going to draw circles on me now? Say prayers?" McCoy didn't flinch. "Only if you ask. But if you want that scar to mean something new, then let it." She dropped to her knees across from him, hands on her thighs, the fire warming her face. "How?" He looked at her, not her scar. "You decide. What does it mean now?" Her lips trembled. "That I walked away." He nodded. "Then we will call it that." He tore a thin strip of leather from a pouch and handed it to her. "Tie this around it, not to hide, but to name." She took the leather, wrapped it over her shoulder, and cinched it with a knot. It didn't hurt. It felt like armor, like a story retold. That night, when she lay beneath the firs, she didn't dream of fire or screaming. She dreamed of a slow river and a hand reaching toward her, Not to pull, not to mark, but to hold. And for the first time, she reached back. Outside, Makoye lay awake, staring at the stars through the smoke hole, whispering, "She is turning her pain into a map. And I will not lead her anywhere she does not choose to go." It was nearly dusk when the riders came, 5 of them, pale coats and silver buttons flashing against the ridge as they descended toward the edge of Makoye's land, where the tall junipers met the flattened earth. Corinne saw them first, kneeling at the smokehouse, her hands red from salting deer meat, and her body stilled in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with memory. Their leader wore the same blue sash the councilman did in town, the kind only given to those who'd traded treaties with the tribes and betrayals with women. "They're not soldiers," she said as Makoye emerged, already stringing his bow but not raising it. "Worse," he muttered. "They're witnesses." The riders stopped a dozen yards away, boots muddy and expressions hard with the kind of pity that cloaked ownership. "We came to see the girl," the lead one said. "The one traded for peace. We have terms to revisit." Corinne stood beside Makoye without flinching. "I have no terms left." The man gave a tight smile. "That's not for you to say. You were a gift, not a party to the agreement." Makoye's voice cut the air clean. "She walks free now. There is no debt." The man dismounted, slow and casual, like approaching a tethered horse. "You're not her husband. There's no marriage under your laws or ours." Corinne stepped forward. "There's no ownership either. I buried that." She pointed to the ridge. "With the veil and the names you gave me." One of the younger men looked uneasy, shifting in the saddle. The leader's smile vanished. "We're taking her back. The council's decided. Peace must be seen to continue." Makoye's bow lifted, not drawn, just steady. "You'll leave," he said, "or I'll bury the lie you rode in on." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was final. The men hesitated, then turned, the lead one staring at Corinne like he wanted to spit but didn't dare. "This isn't over," he muttered. "You're right," she replied. "It's just beginning." When they were gone, Makoye exhaled like a man whose lungs had been filled with dust. Corinne turned to him. "Did I overstep?" "No," he said. "You walked where they feared to." That night she couldn't sleep. The sky was too bright with moonlight, and her mind too loud with old echoes. So she rose, walked barefoot into the clearing, and stood where the councilman had tried to speak for her body. She whispered, "You do not name me," to the dirt, the trees, the stars. Behind her, Makoye didn't approach. He just sat nearby, quiet as breath, keeping watch. Not over her, but beside her. And when she returned to the lodge and laid beside the fire, she whispered to him, "If they come again, I won't hide." "You never did," he answered. "You just forgot how much your silence could shake a mountain." She smiled then, small, real, and the wind outside curled through the trees not like warning, but like applause. The frost came early that year, curling along the riverbank and lacing the pine needles with white before the sun even touched the horizon. Corinne woke with her hands aching. A slow, dull throb she hadn't felt since the early days of her first marriage, when beating bread dough too long had split her knuckles and earned her both shame and silence. But now the ache came from weaving, thread by thread, pelt by pelt, as she helped Makoye repair the winter lodge's inner lining. She had asked to do it. He'd shown her once, then stepped aside, trusting her rhythm. At first her fingers fumbled, used to harsher tasks, not the precision of stitching fur to hide with bone-needled thread. But over days, her hands remembered something older than pain, something soft. She didn't speak much, but she hummed. And Makoye noticed. That song, he said one morning, handing her a bowl of boiled pine tea. Where does it come from? She hesitated. My mother, before she stopped singing. He nodded. Sing it again. She didn't, but she hummed louder. The sound filled the lodge, light as smoke. And slowly, the work became more than labor. It became memory made tangible. On the fourth evening, as she tightened the final stitch of the new lining, she ran her fingers over the inside of the lodge wall and realized she hadn't thought of her dead husband in 2 days. Not his voice, not his boots, not his iron. Just silence and fire, and the shape of Makoye's shoulders bent over something gentle. You don't ask much, she said as he entered with firewood stacked high in his arms. Not from you. Why? He shrugged. If you wish to give, you will. If you don't, it is not yours. Her voice was quiet, but firm. And what if I want to give everything? Makoye set the wood down carefully, then turned, kneeling so they were eye level. Then it must be everything you choose, not everything you owe. That night, she took down the last thing she had kept hidden, a tiny bundle of cloth, sewn tight. Inside, the wedding ring from her first husband. Not gold, just brass. Heavy. Ugly. She walked it down to the creek and held it beneath the surface until her fingers went numb. Then she let go. It sank into the pebbles, caught between 2 stones. She didn't look back. When she returned, Makoye was waiting with a pelt over his shoulders, eyes fixed on the fire. She didn't speak, just sat beside him and placed her hands near the flame. The ache was gone. In its place was something warm, humming in her bones. Not a future, not yet, but the memory of her own voice, returning. And for the first time, she reached for his hand without fear, and he met her halfway, not to claim her, not to possess her, but to hold what was freely offered. Snow fell soft as breath that morning, laying a hush over the valley that made even the ravens seem reverent. Inside the lodge, the fire burned low and steady, and Corinne sat cross-legged with a spindle in her lap and a woven frame before her. Makoye had gone hunting at dawn, leaving her with silence and choice. She didn't know when she began. The weaving just happened, her hands moving before her thoughts, spinning wool and sinew into rows that held more than thread. Each line held memory. The day she buried the veil, the sound of Makoye's voice saying, "You are not in my debt." The cold splash of the creek when she released the ring. She didn't plan a pattern. Just let her fingers tell the story her mouth wasn't ready to. And when the light faded and the snow deepened, she was still there, needle moving, thread tightening. She didn't look up until the lodge flap rustled and Makoye entered, brushing snow from his shoulders, eyes sharp with mountain air. He paused when he saw her, then stepped closer, slow, like he didn't want to break whatever spell lingered. "What is it?" he asked gently. She kept her gaze on the loom. "A blanket, for winter." "For me?" he asked, a note of awe hidden under his calm. She hesitated. "For us." He sat across from her, silent for a long while, then reached forward and traced a finger along one line, a deep, rust-colored stripe running through the middle. "This is where they came for you," he said. "Yes." He pointed to a dark blue wave near the edge. "The river?" She nodded. "And the knot here?" "The scar," she said simply. Makoye leaned back, his eyes not on the blanket, but on her. "You've told more in thread than many speak in a lifetime." She shrugged, trying not to shake. "It's not finished." "Neither are you," he said. And the words weren't meant as comfort. They were truth, shared between equals. That night she laid the half-woven blanket over both their shoulders as they sat by the fire. He didn't kiss her. She didn't lean in. They just sat, warmth rising from the earth and wrapping them in what they were building. Not a romance, but a refuge. Later, when she lay down, she pulled the blanket over herself alone, not out of distance, but ceremony. It was the first thing she'd made since her hands had remembered how. And it was hers, given without asking, kept without claiming. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, Makoye added one more log to the fire, his eyes soft in the glow. "When it's done," he said quietly, "we'll share it on a night the snow forgets to stop." Corinne smiled in the dark, not because she believed in perfect winters, but because someone had finally waited for her to finish her thread before making a promise. She hadn't planned to carry them this far. The small cedar box had stayed tucked deep inside the saddlebag, wrapped in an old scarf that once held her scent, but now only carried time. Her first husband's ashes. The council had insisted she take them, said it was tradition, that his widow should scatter him in a place of peace, though they never defined what peace meant to a woman who'd prayed for his death more than once. Corinne hadn't touched the box in weeks, but as spring edged toward the high ridge and the snow began to pull back from the canyon path, something in her shifted. She saddled the pony Makoye had traded for months ago. Quiet, steady, with eyes that looked back without judgment, and rode out before sunrise, the ashes secured behind her. She didn't tell Makoye. Not because she feared his questions, but because she needed this to be hers alone. The trail was steep, lined with pine and meltwater, and it took most of the morning before she reached the overlook, the place Makoye once called "where silence holds everything." She dismounted and stood at the edge, wind tugging her braid, the box heavy in her hands. She opened it slowly. The ashes were gray, fine, weightless in the way that nothing truly terrible should be. She held the box out, meaning to speak, but no words came. Instead, she thought of what he'd taken. Years, dignity, music. She thought of the nights she'd curled into herself, pretending to sleep. She thought of the brand, the silence, the veil. She whispered only one word, "Enough," and turned the box over. The ashes scattered in the wind, some catching the updraft, others falling into the chasm below. She didn't watch them go. She turned her back to them and walked toward the pony, lighter by a grief she no longer mistook for duty. Makoye was waiting by the lodge when she returned. He didn't ask where she'd been. He just stepped forward and held the pony's reins as she dismounted, his gaze flicking to the now empty saddlebag. "You look different," he said. "I am," she replied. That night she placed the cedar box on the fire, not out of hatred but closure. It cracked softly, then burned quick. Makoye didn't speak until the flames died low. "Did you bury anything today?" She shook her head. "Number I let it fly," he nodded. "Then it was never yours to carry." She looked at him, really looked. "Will you ever ask me to carry something for you?" He smiled gently. "Only if you choose to walk beside me, not behind." And for the first time, she didn't flinch at the thought of walking with someone, not because she had to, but because she could. She reached into the woven blanket, found a loose thread, and began to braid it, slow, intentional, like stitching the final line of a story she never thought she'd finish. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight was hers. The snow was gone by April, washed downriver in slow drifts that melted under pine shadows and midday sun. Wildflowers crept through the thawed soil, dotting the ridge with color so soft it felt like a secret between seasons. Corinne stood outside the lodge, bare arms lifted to hang the newly finished blanket on the drying line, its pattern now complete. 12 rows, each one woven with story, none repeated. Makoye watched from a few steps away, arms crossed, his gaze not on the blanket, but on her hands. "You tied the last thread," he said. She nodded. "And I didn't cry when I did." He stepped forward, careful, reverent. "Then maybe now is the time." She turned to him, a question rising in her eyes, but not on her tongue. He held out something small. Her old scarf, once wrapped around the ashes, now washed, dried, folded. "I kept it," he said. "Not to hold the past, but because it smelled like someone who survived it." She reached for it slowly, fingers brushing his. "Why now?" "Because spring isn't a season here," he said. "It's a choice." He took her hand and pressed it over his heart. "And I have chosen you every day you thought no one saw you." Her breath caught. "Even when I didn't speak?" "Especially then," he said. "Some silences are sacred." She closed her eyes. "I have nothing to give you but myself." "That's all I ever asked for," he said. Then, for the first time, he spoke the words he had never dared voice during winter, not because they weren't true, but because he wanted her to hear them when her soul was ready to receive. "I do not need your service, your obedience, or your past. I want your mornings, your stubbornness, your hand, freely given." She opened her eyes, blinking tears she didn't try to hide. "And if I give it? Then I will place it in mine," he said, "and never close it so tight that you cannot take it back." She laughed softly through the ache. "You sound like no man I've ever known." "That is because I was never raised to own what breathes," he whispered, "only to honor what chooses to stay." She placed her hand in his, then, fully, firmly, not as a servant, not as a debt repaid, but as a woman who had walked through ash and silence and chosen to bloom again. They didn't kiss. They didn't promise forever. But they sat on the porch he'd built, blanket around their shoulders, and watched the valley come alive. A hawk circled overhead. A stream murmured below. And from her lips came the melody her mother had once sung, a song without words, carried on wind, woven into warmth. Makoye closed his eyes to listen, and when she finished, he said only this: "That song will raise our children." She blinked. "Our?" "If you choose," he said. "When you choose." She smiled. "Not yet," he nodded. "Then I'll wait, like spring does." And they sat that way until dusk, two souls not redeemed by each other, but made whole by the slow, steady choosing to stay. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you'd heard him say those words, would you have given him your hand too? Tell us in the comments.